They all saw her move, and that was the part Ethan Cole would never forgive. The first thing he noticed was not the blood, not the alarms, not even the silence hanging over Dock 9 like frozen smoke. It was her eye. One of them was still open, dark and glassy beneath the fractured curve of a silver-blue brow plate, and it tracked the room with the slow, stubborn effort of someone refusing to disappear. Around her, nobody moved. Cargo handlers stood behind a yellow hazard stripe with their hands half-raised. Two medtechs in white emergency skins kept their distance beside a sealed gurney. Above them, the station AI repeated the same order in a calm female voice that sounded almost kind. Do not engage. Unknown biology. Quarantine protocol active. Ethan had worked enough graveyard shifts to know what fear looked like when people dressed it up as procedure. It looked clean. It looked reasonable. It looked exactly like 20 grown adults letting someone die on a polished deck under 12,000 lumens of hospital-grade light. The dock smelled like coolant, hot wiring, and ozone from a shuttle that had landed too hard. Emergency strobes painted the steel floor in slow red pulses. In the middle of it all lay the alien woman, tall, even collapsed, one arm twisted under her side, the other stretched toward nothing. Her skin was blue, not bright or theatrical, but deep and muted, like stormwater under moonlight. The fluid on the deck around her glowed faintly where it touched the seams in the metal. It flowed past Ethan's boot and pooled against the tread, thin as spilled paint, bright as an accusation. A security officer near the bulkhead muttered that command had already logged the incident and that retrieval would arrive in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Ethan looked down at the woman again and saw the smallest movement in her throat. Not enough for anyone who wanted an excuse to miss it. More than enough for him. He was not military. He was not even full medical. His badge marked him as maintenance support for life systems and auxiliary med hardware, the kind of job people only noticed when oxygen ran thin or a diagnostic bed stopped breathing with the patient. He had spent the last 3 hours elbow deep in a filtration unit and still had grease under one nail. Nothing about him belonged. In the center of a crisis. But there she was, still blinking under the red wash of the warning lights while the station talked about compliance. Then he saw her hand move. Just an inch, maybe less. Her fingers dragged lightly against the deck, not reaching for help exactly, just proving she was still inside the body everyone else had already given up on. Something cold and final settled in Ethan's chest. He heard the AI repeat the order again. He heard someone behind him say, "Don't." He stepped over the yellow line anyway. The sound of his boot crossing the stripe seemed louder than the alarms. A medtech swore under his breath. The security officer straightened. Ethan ignored both. He knelt beside her and felt the heat coming off her skin, sharper than human, almost electric. Up close, the damage to her armor looked less like battle and more like betrayal, the kind that happened at close range. Her eye turned toward him. It was not grateful. It was not soft. It was wary, proud, and exhausted beyond language. Good, he thought. That meant she was still here. Ethan pulled off one glove, pressed 2 bare fingers carefully to the side of her neck where the pulse should have been impossible to find, and felt it there, faint and uneven, but real. When the station marked him in violation, he did not look up. He only reached for the emergency phone clipped to his belt and said, so quietly it was almost a prayer, "Hold on." The foam hissed as it left the canister, sealing over the torn edge of Lyra Vane's side in a pale expanding layer that hardened almost at once. The station AI changed its tone by half a degree, which on Meridian Gate counted as panic. Unauthorized intervention in progress. Security response initiated. Ethan kept one hand steady against the foam patch and looked over his shoulder at the nearest medtech. The man did not move. Neither did the woman beside him. Their white emergency suits reflected the red warning lights, making them look dipped in rust. Ethan could see the conflict in their faces even through the transparent shields. They knew he was right. They also knew that being right did not protect anyone on a station built on rules, liability, and fear. "She needs a gurney," Ethan said. "Now." The female medtech swallowed hard and glanced toward the security officer at the bulkhead as if permission might still descend from somewhere holy and official. It did not. The officer touched 2 fingers to his earpiece and stared at Ethan like he was watching a man step into vacuum without a suit. "Retrieval team is 90 seconds out," he said. "Stand down and step away from the subject." Ethan almost laughed at the word subject. The alien woman lay inches from his knees, breathing in shallow, uneven pulls that trembled against his bare knuckles. Subject. As if naming her something smaller would make this easier to watch. Lyra's eyes shifted toward the voices, then back to Ethan. Up close he could see details the room had missed. The fine geometric lines along the side of her neck were not scars but markings, metallic under the skin, catching the light like circuitry under frost. The silver-blue plates of her armor were elegant even damaged, too precise for mass issue, the seams too clean, the material too advanced. Whoever she was not ordinary. And whoever had left her here had known exactly what the station would do once protocol started talking. Ethan slid one arm under her shoulders and felt a jolt of heat through his sleeve, not enough to burn, enough to warn. She was running hot, body fighting to hold itself together. Her hand caught weakly at his wrist. For a second he thought she was trying to stop him. Then her fingers loosened. Trust did not appear all at once. Sometimes it looked like someone being too tired to resist the only person who had come close. The medtech woman made the choice first. She broke from the line, grabbed the sealed gurney, and rolled it across the deck with a metallic rattle that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Her partner cursed under his breath, then rushed to help her unlock the restraints. Security barked at both of them to step back, but the spell had already cracked. Once one person moved, the others had to face what they had been refusing to see. Ethan and the 2 medtechs lifted Lyra as carefully as they could. Even through layers of suit fabric and hardened foam, Ethan could feel how little margin remained. She was taller than he expected, lighter too, all sinew and heat and a strange fragile strength. That did not fit the fear around her. The moment they settled her onto the gurney, the overhead lights shifted from red to white. Containment shutters began to slide over the dock exits with a low hydraulic groan. Ethan knew that sound. Meridian Gate was sealing the sector. Once the retrieval team arrived, she would disappear behind military access and classified paperwork, and whatever chance she still had would be handed over to people more concerned with jurisdiction than life. The female medtech looked at him through her visor. "Auxiliary Med 3 is 50 yards down the service corridor," she said softly. "Off-network for another 10 minutes. Ethan nodded once. That was all they had. He wrapped both hands around the rail and shoved the gurney forward just as the first shutter slammed halfway down. Alarms echoed through the dock, bright and merciless. Behind him someone shouted his name. Ahead of him the corridor narrowed into hard white light and steam haze from an overworked vent. Beside the rise and fall of Lyra's breathing, it sounded almost like weather. Ethan lowered his head and ran. Auxiliary Med 3 was not a real infirmary so much as a forgotten corner of the station where broken equipment was sent to wait for a decision. Ethan shoved the gurney through the half-lit service corridor, past gray pipes wrapped in insulation and wall panels stamped with inspection dates from 3 years back. The wheels rattled over seams in the deck plating, each jolt drawing a tighter line across Lyra Vane's face. Behind them, the alarms had changed rhythm. The first sharp cycle of quarantine response had given way to the slower, heavier pulse of a lockdown spreading deck by deck. Meridian Gate was waking up in layers, and none of those layers would be kind once they found out where he had taken her. The door to Auxiliary Med 3 recognized Ethan's badge with a tired chirp and slid open 6 inches before sticking on its track. He forced his shoulder into it, pushed through, and pulled the gurney inside. The room smelled like antiseptic concentrate, machine oil, and the metallic dryness of recycled air that had spent too long inside sealed walls. One overhead strip flickered, throwing a pale shiver of light across the cabinets and dormant monitors. Ethan hit the manual lock and heard the bolt slide into place a half-second before voices echoed from the corridor outside. He did not have much time. He turned to the nearest console and swiped his badge again. The main diagnostic cradle was still off network, just as the medtech had said, running on local power and old firmware because this room never mattered enough to get an upgrade. For the first time since Doc 9, that felt like mercy. He moved fast. He cut away the hardened edges of the emergency foam and fed the scanner wand across Lyra's torso, watching unreadable layers of anatomy bloom in soft blue lines above the bed. None of it matched human reference architecture. Her organs sat wrong for his instincts, long and elegantly stacked beneath a lattice of denser tissue that shimmered with each shallow breath. The monitor tried 3 times to label her internal systems and failed 3 times with the same sterile message. Classification unavailable. Cross-species medical library restricted. Ethan stared at it for one hard second, then bypassed the blocked menu and forced the cradle into pattern-based triage. He did not need names for what he was seeing. He needed pressure, oxygenation, thermal stability, and a way to keep her alive until he understood the rest. Lyra made a sound then, not loud, more vibration than voice, and his head turned instantly. Her eyes were open now. Both of them. Their color was darker in this light, somewhere between navy and silver, with a reflective depth that made the room seem smaller around them. She was looking at the ceiling first, tracking the weak flicker of the light strip, then at the restraints folded and used against the side of the gurney, then finally at Ethan. There was no panic in her face. There was calculation. A soldier waking in unfamiliar territory. Ethan kept his hands where she could see them. "You are in a medical bay," he said, keeping his voice level. "You are not restrained. I am trying to help you." Her stare sharpened as if she was fitting his words into some internal structure and testing every weak point. When she spoke, her voice was rough with strain but unmistakably precise. "Why?" Just that one word. Not "who are you?" Not "where am I?" Why? Ethan looked down at the scanner readout, then back at her. "Because you were still alive," he said. For the first time, something in her expression shifted. It was small. So small most people would have missed it. But he saw the moment her eyes lost a fraction of their distance, as if that answer had landed somewhere she had not armored properly. Then the console beside him chimed. A hidden data layer had surfaced from the scan, one that the system had not meant to display without command clearance. On the corner of the screen, framed in gold script and an emblem Ethan had never seen before, were 3 words that made the room feel suddenly colder than the corridor outside. Diplomatic bloodline protected. For one suspended second, Ethan forgot the alarms, forgot the locked door, forgot the thin line between a maintenance technician and a man about to ruin his life. Diplomatic bloodline protected glowed in gold at the edge of the screen like something sacred and expensive and deeply dangerous. He looked from the display back to Lyra Vane, and now the details arranged themselves differently in his mind. The precision of her armor. The metallic tracery under her skin. The way even half-conscious, half-failing, she had looked at him as if fear were an indulgence she had never been allowed. Outside the room, boots pounded past in the corridor, then doubled back. Voices rose, blurred by steel and distance. Security was sweeping the deck in widening circles. Ethan muted the monitor and pulled the portable scanner free from its cradle. If Meridian Gate learned exactly who was in this room before he stabilized her, the station would stop being a hospital and turn into a bargaining table. Lyra shifted against the gurney with the controlled stiffness of someone trying not to show pain in front of a stranger. "You saw it," she said. Her voice was still raw, but stronger than it had been a minute ago. Ethan did not pretend otherwise. "Enough to know people are going to care about finding you," he said. Her mouth moved almost into a smile, but there was nothing warm in it. "Care is not the word I would choose." The scanner chimed softly in his hand. Her temperature was still climbing. The foam patch had slowed the leak, not solved it, and the diagnostic overlay showed instability spreading through systems he could not name. Ethan crossed to the supply wall, yanked open a lower cabinet, and started pulling whatever the old base still had in sealed packaging. Flexible tubing. Universal pressure cuffs. 2 sterile field sheets. A compact thermal blanket. A pediatric fluid regulator, the only one small enough to let him fine-tune flow by hand. He spread everything on the counter in a careful line. Auxiliary Med 3 had no active cross-species suite, no clean diplomatic protocol, and no miracle drawer hidden in the back. What it did have was hardware, power, and 10 years of neglected modular equipment. Ethan understood machines better than rules. Machines could be persuaded. He dragged a mobile printer arm across the floor, patched it into the scanner through a maintenance port, and fed it a rough pressure map based on Lyra's scan data. The arm whirred to life, building a translucent support brace one thin layer at a time. Not elegant. Not approved. But the station did not need elegant tonight. It needed something that worked. Lyra watched him with that same unnerving stillness. "You are improvising," she said. Ethan adjusted the printer settings without looking up. "That is a polite way to say it." "In my language," she said, "there is no word for a healer who guesses." Ethan snorted despite himself. "In mine, we call that a Tuesday night." A faint sound left her then, too soft to be called laughter, but close enough that it changed the room. The air still smelled like antiseptic and overheated circuits. The light still flickered. The door still held back a station that would likely arrest him if it opened. But something in the space between them eased by half an inch. Ethan stepped back to the gurney and fitted the printed brace carefully along her side, sealing it over the hardened foam to distribute pressure where her body seemed to be failing fastest. The monitor answered with a steadier line. Not safe. Not even close. But steadier. He reached for the fluid regulator next, then stopped when he noticed a dark stain across his wrist. Her blood had soaked through where his glove had torn on Doc 9, leaving a faint shimmer against his skin. Under the pale medical light, tiny red welts were beginning to rise along the edge of the contact. Lyra saw them at the same moment. Her eyes sharpened. "Do not touch your face," she said quietly. Ethan looked at the stain, then back at her. "Why?" This time, her answer came without distance, and without pride. "Because if my blood has entered yours, they are not the only ones hunting us now." Lyra's words settled into the room more heavily than the alarms ever had. Ethan turned his wrist under the light and watched the shimmer in her blood catch along the ridges of his skin like dust made of stars. The welts were small, raised in a crooked half-circle where the fluid had slipped past the torn edge of his glove, but they were spreading with quiet determination. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just enough to tell him that whatever lived inside her biology did not recognize the borders of his. He crossed to the sink, ran sterile rinse over the stain, and saw at once that water did almost nothing. The shimmer clung. The skin around it flushed warmer. Behind him, Lyra pushed herself a fraction higher on the gurney, then stopped when the motion cost her more than she had expected. The effort pulled a sharper line through her expression, but she did not let any sound follow it. Ethan reached for a sealed Deccan wipe, tore it open with his teeth, and cleaned the contact area as thoroughly as he could. The shimmer faded. The heat did not. "What happens if it entered my blood?" he asked. Lyra took a careful breath before answering. "My people carry adaptive markers. Defensive chemistry. Diplomatic lines carry stronger versions. It is meant to identify kin, signal rank, and protect against tampering. In the wrong system, it can trigger immune confusion." Ethan glanced back at her. Immune confusion sounded like the kind of phrase rich governments used when they wanted a problem to sound elegant. How bad? Her eyes held his for one quiet beat too long. "It depends on how much crossed over." That was not an answer, and they both knew it. Another impact hit the corridor outside, harder this time, followed by the crackle of a security command over external speakers. Sector sweep authorized. All off-network medical units report status immediately. Ethan looked toward the locked door, then to the dead network indicator on the wall console. Auxiliary Med 3 still sat in its small pocket of neglect, invisible for the moment, but the station was closing in. He needed information. He needed time. He had neither. He pulled a portable bioreader from the supply cart, clipped it over his wrist, and watched it struggle through a sequence of uncertain tones before giving him a stream of useless yellow warnings. Unknown protein activity. Elevated skin temperature. Cross-reactive response possible. He almost threw the thing across the room. Instead he set it down gently, because breaking tools never helped anybody. Lyra studied him with the same guarded attention she had used since waking, but there was something else there now, some faint disturbance beneath the pride and caution. "You should leave," she said. "If the exposure is shallow, station medicine can suppress it. If you remain with me, they will assume contamination, intent, or alliance." Ethan leaned both hands on the counter and let out one slow breath through his nose. "That is a very polished way of telling me to save myself." "It is a practical way," Lyra said. Practical. The word hung between them with all the warmth of steel. Ethan looked at the room around them. The flickering light. The half-obsolete equipment. The printer arm still cooling beside the gurney. Then he looked at the woman who had almost died beneath 12,000 lumens while a station full of civilized people waited for permission to care. He thought about the medtech who had moved only when someone else broke first. He thought about protocol speaking in a calm voice while a living person bled under it. "No," he said quietly. Practical would have been staying behind the yellow line. For the first time since he had met her, Lyra had no immediate reply. Her gaze dropped to his wrist where the redness was still building under the skin, then lifted slowly back to his face as if she were measuring him against a standard she had never expected a human to meet. The room hummed with low power and thin recycled air. Somewhere above them, the station groaned as containment doors sealed another deck. Then the hidden console behind Ethan flashed once, twice, and opened a channel it should not have possessed. Across the dark screen, in clean gold script, a message began to write itself line by line. Bloodline breach detected. Proximity bond initiated. Protective claim has been registered. The message on the hidden console remained on the screen with the patient certainty of something that did not care whether Ethan understood it or not. Protective claim has been registered. He stared at the gold script until the words began to feel less like language and more like pressure, a hand settling on the back of his neck. His wrist had gone from warm to hot. Not unbearable, not yet, but wrong in a way his body could not ignore. The bioreader clipped over his skin gave a soft protest tone and scrolled another line of yellow text he did not trust. Lyra saw his eyes move toward the monitor and closed hers for one brief second, as if she had been hoping the system was too damaged to complete whatever process it had started. When she opened them again, the last of her distance had changed shape. It had not vanished. It had become caution sharpened by regret. Ethan stepped closer to the console and tapped the side panel, pulling up the diagnostic trail beneath the message. Most of it was encrypted in a script he could not read, but one translated phrase surfaced through the station interface in plain trade language. Emergency lineage defense. Civilian shelter response. He let out a slow breath. Shelter response. That sounded less like poison and more like a system deciding for itself that he now belonged in the radius of someone important. He looked back at Lyra. "Tell me exactly what this is." Her gaze dropped to his wrist, where the redness now formed a faint branching pattern under the skin, delicate as frost on glass. Then she answered with the kind of honesty that only arrives when hiding the truth is no longer useful. "My blood recognized intent," she said. Ethan gave a disbelieving half-laugh. "Intent." "Yes. She shifted carefully against the brace he had printed for her, each movement measured, proud even now. Certain bloodlines are engineered for preservation. If one of us is critically compromised and an outside life form makes direct protective contact, the markers can trigger a temporary bond response. It is old. Political. Biological. Ethan leaned back against the counter. Bond response sounded too close to superstition for a man standing in a room full of machines, yet the heat in his wrist was real, and the console had not invented that message for entertainment. What does temporary mean? Lyra hesitated. That silence told him more than the first answer had. Finally she said, "It means the system now identifies you as protected under my claim until separation protocols are completed or until my line revokes the status." Ethan rubbed a hand across his mouth and looked at the locked door. So if security finds me in here, they do not just see a maintenance tech who broke quarantine. They see somebody tied to you. Lyra did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. Outside, another wave of boots passed in the corridor, closer this time, followed by the electronic chirp of a lock scanner testing doors one by one. Auxiliary Med 3 was becoming less invisible by the minute. Ethan crossed back to the gurney and checked the brace seal, then adjusted the fluid regulator by a quarter turn. Lyra watched his hands with a strange intensity, as if careful work meant something different to her now. "You should be angry," she said softly. Ethan looked up. "I am busy." "At what?" "Staying ahead of the part where all of this gets worse." Something almost human moved through her expression then, not softness exactly, but the beginning of it. In Ethan's culture, rescue had always been told as a simple story. Somebody is in trouble. Somebody helps. Then it is over. But nothing in this room was simple. Help had consequences. Kindness had paperwork, politics, biology, and now whatever invisible law had wrapped itself around his bloodstream because he had refused to step back. He did not regret it. That was the part that surprised him. He should have regretted it by now. Instead he felt only the clear, cold shape of the next problem arriving. The old wall terminal crackled and came alive with a station-wide override. A male voice, smooth and official, filled the room. "Attention all personnel. By order of Command Authority, Meridian Gate is now under diplomatic seizure review. Any individual found aiding the unidentified foreign asset will be detained for interference in treaty security." Lyra's face went still in a way Ethan had learned to distrust. "You hear that," he said. "Asset. Not patient. Not diplomat." Her eyes lifted to his. They were calm now, but not because she was unafraid. Calm because the thing she had feared was finally here. "They know who I am," she said. Then she looked past him to the sealed door, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone very quiet. "Which means the people hunting me are already on this station." For half a second, Ethan did not move. The station announcement still hung in the air, thin and metallic, while the lights in Auxiliary Med 3 flickered against the edges of the old cabinets. "People hunting me are already on this station." The words landed with a strange, quiet weight. Not because they were surprising. Because they made everything smaller. The room. The time left. The distance between one bad decision and a sealed report with his name on it. Ethan crossed to the wall panel and killed the overhead speaker. The silence that followed felt more honest. Then he looked at Lyra Vane and finally allowed himself to ask the question that had been building since Doc 9. "Who are you to make a station lock itself down like this?" Lyra held his gaze. Even pale from blood loss, even braced and half-reclined on a forgotten medical bed, she carried herself with the kind of control that made the room arrange itself around her. "I was sent here to sign a continuity accord," she said. Ethan frowned. "A ceasefire." "More than that. Trade corridors. Border passage. Civilian evacuation guarantees." Her eyes shifted briefly toward the sealed door, then back to him. Enough peace to threaten every faction that profits from war. Ethan let that settle. He had spent most of his life near machines, not diplomats, but he knew what happened to people who stood between powerful groups and a profitable disaster. They did not get inconvenient. They got removed. Another sound came from the corridor outside, softer this time. Not boots. A magnetic chirp, then the scrape of something testing the door frame. Ethan reached for the portable scanner on instinct and killed the room lights down to minimum. Auxiliary Med 3 fell into a dim wash of monitor glow and weak spillover from the frosted door seam. Lyra's skin looked darker in the blue light, almost silver at the edges. Her eyes narrowed as she listened. "Not station security," she said. Ethan looked at her. "How can you tell?" "Security moves loudly on purpose. They want fear to arrive before they do. Whoever is outside is trying not to be heard." That was not comforting. Ethan moved to the supply rack and pulled down a folded transit sling, a compact thermal wrap, and a spare maintenance badge strip with a stripped access chip still taped to the back. He shoved the scanner and fluid regulator into a side pouch and began transferring what he could from the gurney to something portable. Lyra watched him work with the same focused stillness that had become its own kind of pressure. "You already know they will come through that door," she said. Ethan tightened the strap on the sling. "Yes. Yet you are not leaving me." He glanced at her without stopping. "No." For the first time, her composure broke in a way so slight it might have vanished under a weaker voice. "Why?" Ethan almost answered with something simple. "Because you are hurt. Because it is the right thing. Because I started this and I am not walking away." But none of those felt complete enough for the room they were standing in. So he told the truth as cleanly as he could. Because they were counting on everyone to step back. Lyra said nothing. He slid one arm behind her shoulders and helped her upright. She was taller than he had realized, even weakened, and for one unstable second her weight settled against him through the thermal wrap, all heat and restraint and the fine controlled tremor of someone refusing to collapse in front of a witness. Ethan felt the branching warmth in his wrist flare in answer, as if the bond her blood had triggered recognized proximity and approved of it. He ignored that as hard as he could. "Can you walk?" he asked. "A short distance," she said. "Not fast." "Then we do not go where they expect fast." He keyed open the maintenance schematic on his wrist pad and brought up the deck under Auxiliary Med 3. Old stations had habits. Hidden arteries. Service shafts nobody modernized because nobody glamorous ever needed them. A waste heat duct ran below the room and connected to maintenance spine 9, then to cargo refrigeration, then to a diplomatic shuttle cradle 3 decks over. Not safe. Not clean. Possible. Ethan angled the wrist pad so Lyra could see it. Her eyes sharpened immediately. "You know infrastructure," she said. "Better than politics," Ethan replied. "Good," she said softly. "Politics is what got me here." The chirp at the door frame came again, followed by the delicate pop of an external override tool engaging old bolts one at a time. Whoever was outside had found the manual housing. Ethan killed the final monitor, wrapped the thermal sling across Lyra's shoulders, and guided her toward the rear service grate hidden behind a bank of obsolete oxygen canisters. He ripped the grate loose with both hands just as the first lock on the main door clicked open. Cold air rushed up from the dark shaft below, carrying dust, machine heat, and the deep iron hum of the station's heart. Ethan looked once over his shoulder at the sealed room that had kept them alive for less than an hour. Then he helped Lyra down into the dark. Above them, the second lock gave way. The shaft below Auxiliary Med 3 was barely 3 feet wide and ran hotter than Ethan expected, a narrow vertical channel webbed with conduit, dust, and old maintenance rails polished smooth by decades of vibration. He went first for the first 6 feet, then braced himself on a support rung and reached back up for Lyra. Even injured, she descended with careful precision, one hand gripping the rail, the other pressed against the thermal wrap at her side. She did not waste motion. She did not complain. But when her boots touched the lower platform, Ethan felt the shift in her balance before he saw it. He caught her elbow and held her there for a second in the dim amber glow of a service light no brighter than a night lamp. The station around them breathed in metal. Fans turned somewhere far below. Coolant pulsed through pipes in a steady buried rhythm. Above their heads, muffled through layers of deck plating, came the dull sound of the door to Auxiliary Med 3 finally opening. Ethan did not need to imagine what the room looked like now. Empty bed. Cold monitors. Rear grate torn loose. Enough to tell the wrong people that whoever had taken her knew the station better than a frightened witness should. He angled his wrist pad toward the corridor branching from the shaft. Maintenance spine 9 stretched ahead in 2 directions, one leading toward cargo refrigeration, the other toward a utility crossover used by diplomatic crews when they wanted privacy from the main concourse. Ethan had never been inside the diplomatic quarter. Men like him fixed doors and filters. They did not pass through gold-trimmed corridors or treaty lounges. But the station maps did not care about rank. Metal still connected to metal. Lyra looked at the schematic, then at him. "The shuttle cradle," she said quietly. "You believe I still intend to leave?" Ethan started down the narrow passage, keeping one hand near the wall for balance as the deck vibrated underfoot. "If you have a better plan, now would be a great time." She followed, slower but steady. "There are 3 kinds of people who survive an assassination attempt," she said. "Those who vanish. Those who retaliate. Those who arrive alive where they were expected dead." Ethan glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Which one are you?" In the low amber light, her face looked carved from shadow and pale blue stone, all hard lines and disciplined control, but something more exposed lived in her eyes now. "The third," she said. That answer should have sounded political. Instead it sounded personal, old enough to have cost her something long before Dock 9. They reached the crossover hatch and Ethan crouched beside the access panel, stripping the taped chip from the spare maintenance badge and sliding it into the manual override slot. The hatch clicked, hesitated, then opened 4 inches with a sigh of stale cold air from the other side. Diplomatic decks used lower humidity and cleaner circulation. Even the air felt expensive. Ethan pushed the hatch wider, then froze when a soft chime touched his wrist. The bioreader, still strapped over the red branching lines on his skin, had changed from yellow to blue. A second line of translated text rolled across the tiny screen. Bond stability rising. Protected individual recognized as active guardian. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. Lyra saw the display and closed the distance between them by one silent step. "I did not know it would adapt this quickly," she said. He looked up sharply. "You keep saying things like that as if it is supposed to make me feel better." "It is not," she answered, and for the first time there was no cool distance in her tone at all. "It is supposed to tell you that my blood has made a decision before I had the right to." Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than he meant to. Somewhere behind them, faint and far through the maintenance spine, came voices and the metallic ring of equipment hitting rail. Search teams had entered the lower channels. He pushed the hatch open fully and motioned her through. The diplomatic crossover was quieter, cleaner, lined with white composite panels and recessed floor lights that washed everything in a soft lunar glow. For a few seconds they moved without speaking, their footsteps muted, the station suddenly too polished to belong to the same world as the shaft below. Then Lyra stopped beside a dark observation window overlooking the stars. The black beyond the glass was huge and still. Her reflection floated over it, pale and tired and impossibly composed. When she spoke, her voice came softer than he had heard it yet. "They were not supposed to leave me on the dock," she said. Ethan turned toward her. "They were supposed to make it look official. Delayed. Sanitized. A diplomatic loss wrapped in procedure." Her eyes stayed on the glass. What failed was not their plan. What failed was their understanding of your kind. Ethan said nothing. He did not know what answer belonged in a corridor like this. Lyra finally looked at him, and whatever rank, protocol, or bloodline stood behind her, the woman in front of him looked suddenly very tired. I was prepared for hostility, she said. For contempt. For negotiation. I was not prepared for mercy. The words reached him more deeply than they should have, maybe because they sounded less like gratitude and more like grief. Then the corridor lights ahead shifted from white to amber, and a calm synthetic voice spoke from hidden speakers in a dialect Ethan knew too well. Diplomatic shuttle cradle locked. External launch control transferred. Authorized claimant approaching. Lyra went still. Ethan felt the heat in his wrist flare like a warning. Authorized claimant, he repeated. Lyra did not blink. In my world, she said, that word does not mean rescue. The corridor seemed to narrow around the words. Authorized claimant approaching. Ethan felt the heat in his wrist pulse once, then settle into a steadier burn, like his own body had decided panic would only waste oxygen. Ahead, the floor lights along the diplomatic shuttle cradle glowed amber in two clean rows, leading toward a sealed launch bay with white alloy doors and a narrow strip of black glass at eye level. Everything here was polished enough to hide fear. Even the air smelled different, filtered down to something colder, thinner, almost ceremonial. Lyra Vane stood beside the observation window with the stars behind her and looked, for the first time. Since Doc 9, less like a survivor than someone cornered by history itself. Ethan turned fully toward her. Then tell me what it means. Lyra kept her eyes on the sealed bay doors. In my world, a claimant is one who invokes lawful possession through blood, rank, or contract. Diplomatic wards, ships, titles, even heirs can be claimed in times of instability. Ethan stared at her for one hard second. Possession. Her jaw tightened. Yes. He looked back at the bay. So whoever is coming does not want to escort you out. They want to own the ending. Lyra said nothing, and that silence was enough. The speakers above them remained quiet now, as if the station itself understood it had said the important part and could leave the rest to dread. Ethan stepped to the nearest wall console and dragged up the cradle status. External launch control locked. Internal override denied. Claim authority pending biometric confirmation. Beneath that, a smaller line flashed in station trade. Treaty observer presence required for asset transfer. Ethan almost laughed again at the word asset, but there was no humor left in him for it. Instead he looked at the reflection in the black glass. A maintenance tech with grease still trapped under one nail. A torn sleeve. A wrist marked by alien blood and a biological legal fiction he had never asked for. Beside him, a woman powerful enough to freeze a station and vulnerable enough to have nearly died under fluorescent lights because procedure had been more comfortable than courage. He thought about the yellow line on Dock 9. How easy it would have been to stay behind it. How clean his life would still be if he had. Then he thought about the look in her eye when everyone else had stepped back. Ethan exhaled slowly and reached for the one thing he understood better than politics, better than protocol, better than any of the polished lies built into stations like Meridian Gate. Infrastructure. Every system had assumptions buried inside it. Most failed at the edges. He pulled the maintenance schematic back up and overlaid power routing for the diplomatic cradle. Old stations recycled redundancies in ugly ways. 3 decks below the launch bay, emergency life support still shared a relay spine with ceremonial access control because nobody had wanted to pay to separate them after the treaty wing was added. Ethan smiled without meaning to. Lyra noticed. What is it? Your people built a palace on top of a service crawlspace, he said. She blinked once. Is that good? It is if the palace forgot who keeps the lights on. He moved fast then, fingers sliding over the wall console, pushing past locked menus through maintenance backdoors written by bored engineers years before either of them had ever met. He rerouted a diagnostic handshake through climate control, then used the handshake to trigger an integrity review on the cradle doors. The polished white panels ahead of them dimmed by one shade. Not open. Not yet. But listening. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, measured and unhurried. Not security this time. Security stomped. These steps arrived like certainty. Lyra straightened despite the brace, despite the thermal wrap, despite everything her body had spent the last hour surviving. Her face became unreadable again, but Ethan knew better now than to mistake unreadable for untouched. The footsteps stopped just beyond the turn in the corridor. A voice came next, smooth and amplified by distance rather than volume. By authority of Vane succession law, transfer the protected bloodline and stand aside. Ethan did not move. Neither did Lyra. The wall console chimed. Integrity review complete. Manual witness declaration available. He stared at the new line for half a breath, then understood. Treaty observer presence required. The station had not expected someone like him to be here. But he was here. He touched the declaration field and the system opened a simple prompt. State observed condition of transfer subject. Lyra turned toward him so sharply he could feel the motion more than see it. Ethan, she said, and that was all, just his name, but it carried warning, disbelief, and something deeper than either. He looked at her once. Then he looked at the dark turn in the corridor where the claimant waited without hurrying, confident that law and rank and fear would finish the work Mercy had interrupted. Ethan leaned toward the console. His voice, when it came, was steady. Observed condition, subject was abandoned while critically injured. Immediate aid was obstructed by protocol manipulation. Claim status is compromised by failure of custodial duty. Beside him, Lyra went perfectly still. The console flashed blue, then gold. Witness declaration logged. Emergency protective claim elevated. Guardian precedence confirmed pending diplomatic review. The corridor. Lights changed at once from amber to white. Somewhere deep in the cradle bay, massive locks disengaged with a clean mechanical sequence that sounded, to Ethan, like the station itself taking a side. The voice beyond the turn lost some of its polish then. That declaration is unauthorized. Ethan kept one hand on the console. Maybe, he said quietly. But I was there. Silence followed. Real silence. Heavy enough to hear the ventilation moving through hidden ducts. Then the bay doors ahead of them slid open, not fast, not dramatic, just smooth and certain, revealing a compact diplomatic shuttle washed in soft blue light. Its hull markings matched the metallic tracery beneath Lyra's skin. She looked at the open bay, then at Ethan, and all the titles in the galaxy seemed to fall away from her face for one unguarded second. No one had ever stood witness for me, she said. Ethan did not know what to do with a sentence like that, so he told her the plain truth instead. They should have. Something in her expression broke and healed at the same time. Not weakness. Recognition. Behind them, the hidden claimant did not advance. The law had shifted under his feet, and for the moment that was enough. Ethan helped Lyra toward the shuttle. At the threshold she stopped, reached up with careful fingers, and unclasped a narrow silver insignia from the inner seam of her damaged armor. It was small, almost weightless, shaped like a star folded around a vertical line. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers over it with a touch that was steady despite everything. In my language, she said softly, this is given to the one who preserved dignity when law did not. Ethan looked down at the insignia resting against the branching marks on his wrist. Beyond the open bay, stars burned in silence older than every treaty ever written. When he looked up again, Lyra had stepped into the shuttle light, blue skin turned silver at the edges, eyes dark and clear and no longer alone. The station hummed around them, all metal and procedure and borrowed power, but it felt different now, as if one honest act had bent its shape by an inch. Sometimes that was all